Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our first presentation in the fall 2018 occasional lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. I just ask that if you have your cell phone on, could you turn it off or to silent, because we're going to be recording. And today we welcome William Overholt, who's been a senior research fellow at Harvard since 2008. From 2013 to 2015, he was also president of the Fung Global Institute in Hong Kong. And from 2002 to 2008, he was distinguished chair and director of the RAND Corporation's Center for Asia-Pacific Policy. He served as Asia Regional Head of Strategy and Economics for Nomura from 1998 to 2001. And before that, he was managing director and regional head of research at Bank Boston, Singapore. He also spent 18 years at Bankers Trust, where he managed a country risk team in New York from 1980 to 1984, serving as regional strategist in Hong Kong. And at the Hudson Institute from 1971 to 1979, he directed planning studies for the US Department of State, National Security Council, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and Council on International Economic Policy. Dr. Overholt has published 8 books, which means he's a wage buster among us academics, including his most recent book, which he will talk about today, China's Crisis of Success, which was just published this year. And he has sold out of the books. He was in Madison, Wisconsin yesterday, and Madisonites bought all of his books. So we do have a pamphlet for the book, and you can get a 30% discount with the handout. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome and ask you to join me in welcoming Bill Overholt speaking on China's crisis of success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. It's my first time at your university, and really pleased to have the chance. I come with a different image of China than most of what you read about in the American media or here coming out of Washington, D.C. We hear about Xi Jinping as the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. We hear that he's China's Putin. And the Trump administration seems to have an image of China as this behemoth that's just going to realize I'm supposed to turn on a microphone. So the U.S. has this image of China, particularly in Washington, as this authoritarian behemoth that's just going to roll over us poor helpless Americans unless we take some kind of drastic action. And they, even among scholars, we get this constant image of Xi Jinping as the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong, as China's Putin. And I'm going to give you a much more complicated image. And I always seem to have a different view from the conventional wisdom. 25 years ago, I wrote a book called The Rise of China: How Economic Reform is Creating a New Superpower. And at the time, the conventional wisdom was that China was due for a collapse. And the leading review in London said Mr. Overholt's bank must have paid him a lot of money to write such nonsense. The reason I come up with a different view is I come at China from a comparative perspective. I thought that China was going to become a new superpower because it was basically copying ideas from South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, a little bit Japan, and we knew that those ideas worked. The question was whether you could scale them up to the size of China, and Deng Xiaoping answered that question for us. I want to go back and use that same perspective of China as one of the Asian miracle economies and see if we can't get a perspective on where China stands. Today, we can't make clear predictions like the one I made in the beginning of the 90s. China's future is very uncertain. So what we can do is we can characterize the situation it's in, and then we can look at indicators that'll enable everybody to tell for themselves how things are going. See if we can get back to the beginning. There we go. So these Asian miracle economies are a group. They're South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, to some extent Japan. Japan's different because it was reconstructing a modern economy. It wasn't building one from scratch. And these miracle economies share some characteristics. The World Bank, the world's leading economists have studied to death the reasons for the great economic success. The economic recipe is very clear to everybody, but there are only about 8 countries that follow the recipe. Why is that? Well, very simple economics and very simple politics. Simple economics, you start off with peasants and the owners of land and people building roads and people making cheap socks. It's such a simple economy, even a government can understand it. Simple politics is a little hard to understand. These are all countries that were scared out of their minds. It's Japan after World War II, South Korea after the Korean War, Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War, Singapore after a very traumatic separation from Malaya, and China after a really bad hair century. And you had a universal fear of collapse. And that does 2 things. It forces leaders to think, I'd better take big, risky decisions or my society is just going to fall apart. And the people say, well, we're afraid our kids aren't going to have enough to eat. We might have civil war. If some leader comes along with an inspiring idea, we'll accept more stress than normal populations would ever accept. And so both the economics and the politics at the beginning are simple. And that doesn't mean there aren't factions, that doesn't mean there aren't tough economic decisions, but it's not normal politics or normal modern economics. Now, what happens when you succeed is that things get very complicated, both economically and politically. And what I'm going to be focusing on is the problem of complexity. So I want to characterize the situation China's in. And my characterization of that situation is that China's in a crisis of success. Now, what do I mean by that weird phrase? Think of an entrepreneur who invents a cool widget and the sales of that widget just take off, but everything depends on the personal leadership of this entrepreneur. And the company gets to a point where it has to raise more money. It has to list on the stock exchange. And all of a sudden it needs really professional accounting and really professional human resources and a board of directors and a public rule book. The company has to transform itself. And if it does, it keeps on going. If it doesn't, it hits its Elon Musk moment and can get into very serious trouble. All these Asian miracle economies hit this point of a crisis of success in a very dramatic way because they're growing so fast. They're becoming complicated in a very rapid way. The same thing happens in all of them. In Taiwan and South Korea, this happened at the end of the 1970s and through the early 1980s. The big companies find themselves in some degree of difficulty. In China today, the big state enterprises can't earn back their cost of capital. In South Korea, the conglomerates, they call them chaebol, got overloaded with debt, and most of them went bankrupt in the Asian crisis of 1997. And the economy as a whole finds itself with an unusual amount of debt. It can be foreign debt in South Korea, it can be local debt in China, but a lot of debt. And the politics changes. You get more demonstrations, more people trying to have demonstrations, and because the economic sectors become large, you get very powerful interest groups. And at that point, the Elon Musk moment, everything depends on how leaders handle the situation. In Taiwan, Jiang Jingguo, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, was a pretty tough, nasty guy. He was a member of the Soviet Communist Party. He was a tough security chief, in some ways much tougher than the tough guys on the mainland. The mainland, they put you in jail and let you get sick, and maybe you die, maybe you don't. Jiang Jingguo would have people taken out to Green Island and shot. But Jingguo was close to his society, so he understood when the demonstrations got serious and when the big companies started having financial difficulties, that he needed to allow things to gradually change. And so Taiwan had a relatively smooth transition through its crisis of success. In South Korea, Park Chung-hee thought he could push back the tide. The result was a great crisis in 1979, and later the whole system essentially went bust in 1997-98. Politically, they started having a lot of student demonstrations, and in October of '79, there was a great student demonstration planned, and the Korean CIA, run by the #2 most powerful man in South Korea and one of Park Chung-hee's best friends, told the president, you're going to have to make concessions. You're going to have to change the system or we're going to have chaos. But President Park's bodyguards said, station sharpshooters on the roofs of tall buildings and shoot the student leaders. Park Chung-hee decided to go with the bodyguards, and the Korean CIA chief didn't think that was a good idea, so he took the president out for dinner with a couple pretty girls and shot the president in the head. That was a more difficult transition. If you try to push back the tide, the consequences can be severe. So how is China handling the situation? Well, on the economic side, you probably have the most sophisticated economic planning in world history. This started well before Xi Jinping. The National Development Reform Commission worked with the World Bank to write a book called China 2030, called for market reforms, changes in governance. Then after Xi Jinping took power in what was called the Third Plenum, they published a very detailed plan. You start with the axiom of market allocation of resources, deduce over 300 reform policies from that basic axiom. That solves the problem of complexity because it makes most of the decisions automatic. The market's going to make them. In economic theory, it should be much more efficient. On the political side, the theory has been we need to get things under control in a very tough way. And what's happened is that the politics has gotten in the way of implementing the economics, and the politics theory is we're going to sit on the lid of a boiling kettle and hope it doesn't blow off. And you have to keep putting more and more weight on the boiling kettle to avoid serious problems. So how did they approach this crisis of success? It starts with the tremendous market reforms under Zhu Rongji. Under Zhu Rongji, 45 million workers in manufacturing jobs lost their jobs and had to move to other jobs. When you compare that with the US losing 3 million manufacturing jobs in a comparable period, we're still coping with some of the consequences of that. Now, China did a much better job of moving those workers into service industries and better jobs than we have, but still it was quite traumatic. And Zhu Rongji announced an intention to cut the government in half. Now, for Americans, think if Ronald Reagan had said, I'm going to cut the US government in half. It would have been unthinkable. And Zhu Rongji largely succeeded at the upper levels. But the result of these tremendous changes was Chinese society was just stressed out. People just couldn't take it anymore. The last 18 months of Zhu Rongji, people expressed almost hatred of him. He's put us through all this, and he hasn't solved all the problems of China. Now he's back to being a hero, which is quite appropriate, but that was the mood. And so the next leader, Hu Jintao, was a guy who promised a harmonious society. And harmonious society meant many philosophical things at different levels, but operationally it meant no more stressful Zhu Rongji market reforms. So they didn't do market reforms for a while. And things got very sluggish. They had a structure of 9 leaders running the country. They ran it by majority vote. If Hu Jintao couldn't get 5 votes, his policy didn't last. We have a structure like that in this country. It's called the Supreme Court. Decisions are very judicious, at least they were up until now. But they weren't very fast and very exciting. And that was what happened under Hu Jintao. Plus, the old leaders like Jiang Zemin were always interfering and trying to block what Hu Jintao was trying to do. And Hu himself, who in his early days was known as a very lively, skirt-chasing kind of guy. But by the time he got the big job, he had severe diabetes and didn't have much energy, and came across very clearly in his public appearances. So just a few years into Hu Jintao's rule, the senior leaders started saying things seem to be getting out of control. The ministries aren't listening to the prime minister. The provinces aren't listening to the center. The military is doing things it's not supposed to do. And you have these powerful interest groups. Now, Americans think the National Rifle Association is a powerful interest group. Well, let me describe a really powerful interest group, China's petroleum faction. These people controlled the flow of energy for China, trillions of dollars over a period of time. And it was an official price and a market price, and they arbitraged the difference and put much of that difference in their pockets. So they made tens of billions of dollars. And they were led by one of the 9 leaders in the Politburo Standing Committee, Zhou Yongkang, and he was chief of security for all of China. Now that's a powerful interest group. Chinese interest groups are the size of European countries, so getting them under control is a serious task. So on the economic side, they decided market allocation of resources is the way to go. On the political side, got to centralize, got to get things under control. And this is all separate from the choice of Xi Jinping as the leader. We're going to go from 9 guys, and it's always guys, in the Politburo Standing Committee to 7. And the 7 aren't going to include the extreme reformers like Wang Yang, and they're not going to include people spouting Maoist slogans like Bo Xilai. It's going to be easier to make decisions. And the new guy is going to get control of the military right away. He's not going to have to wait 2 years the way Hu Jintao did. And they created these small leading groups in charge of Taiwan policy and military reform and economic reform, all sorts of things, and a National Security Council to coordinate everything connected with foreign policy, and put these all under one person. And so very tough effort to centralize things. Now, then you get into the problems. Market allocation of resources hurts every power group in China. If you turn decisions over to the market, party groups lose power. Government groups lose power. Interest rates rise. The people have to pay higher interest rates. The state enterprises get put on a market basis. They're supposed to lose their privileges. And that hurts the banks because the bank's customers are these big state enterprises. And the military was due to get reformed, so they were unhappy. Now, this creates a very risky situation. I led a political risk group for years. And the way I got that job was predicting trouble in various countries. And so, for instance, when I saw the Shah of Iran alienating every major interest group in the country, I said, you know, he's going to go down. And when I saw the government of Poland in 1980, my bank was the biggest lender to Poland. When I saw that the leadership had alienated every major interest group, I said, they're going down. 8 months later, they did. So how do you handle this situation where you've got all these powerful interest groups on the other side? Well, the very powerful lever, the anti-corruption campaign. Who's the first big target? Zhou Yongkang, head of the petroleum faction. I go after leading generals. And, over time, they've arrested more than 100,000 people, including very, very senior officials. But that creates another problem. They go after every major group at the same time. And again, you get pushback from every power group in China. And you're using this to move aside the obstacles to reform, like the petroleum faction. But as you do this, everybody gets scared. And so if I'm in charge of a reform that's going to step on your toes, you're going to say, I'm corrupt. And I probably am. So I feel very vulnerable. So instead of taking a very strong reform line, I'm going to try to hide under the desk like a student trying to be in the back row where the professor won't see her. And so reform hasn't gone very quickly. So the theory became, we'll spend the first term, 5 years, consolidating power. And they've done that very thoroughly and successfully. All the adversaries have been eliminated. And the second 5 years, which just began, are supposed to be implementing these reforms. But then they got to thinking there are going to be an awful lot of unhappy, powerful people after we do these reforms. So whoever comes next might try to reverse the reforms and might try to take a very serious retaliation against the leaders who implemented these unpopular reforms. So hence the idea of a third term. Well, so how are we doing on this reform period? And the key thing I want to leave you with is that Xi Jinping has not been willing to make the hard decisions. Whenever he has a choice of, I'm going to eat my cake or have my cake, he says, we're going to have our cake and eat it too. And so we have the idea of market allocation of resources, but China is going to take leadership in world manufacturing through huge subsidies, and it's going to get innovation through $1.7 trillion of subsidies to very big companies. It's a little difficult to square that with market allocation of resources. And there are about a dozen of these kinds of trade-offs or contradictions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but let me just mention a few obvious ones. The state enterprises are supposed to be put on a market basis, but party supervision of them is supposed to be tightened. Well, are you going to be making market business decisions, or are you going to be making political decisions? It's a choice. Xi Jinping is very eloquent about the importance of the rule of law, but he talks about strengthening the party commission that oversees the verdicts in the key cases. All the tough controls are intended to stabilize the country in a situation where they were afraid of centrifugal forces and supposed to convey a sense of stability. But how does the Chinese population see that? Well, they see it as a sign that things are uneasy and that the leaders are worried. And people in Washington see this monolith. It's just powering on forward, but it's been years since I talked with a middle or upper class Chinese family that wasn't trying to get much of its money and its kids out of China. And so again, there's a trade-off between what the policy is supposed to accomplish and and what it is accomplishing. This leads me to a very different characterization of Xi Jinping's role than even most scholars. It's true that he has defeated all his adversaries. That's very impressive, and he's got this huge list of titles. But that's different. It's a different dimension from being able to implement your policies. And so far, the policy implementation on the economic side has been pretty weak. So these things I talked about in the previous two slides may sound a little more like Britain's Theresa May than like Mao Zedong. It's always saying we're going to have our cake and eat it too, and not acknowledging that there are boundaries out there. Is Xi Jinping China's Putin? This is probably the most common characterization of him in the US press. I think almost the opposite. Xi Jinping is a creature of the Communist Party. He was hired to do a job. Putin's party is a creature of Putin. It exists to make him more powerful and make him more money. And this is a positive for China. It's a much more institutionalized system. But what we see here is a system that is reacting against weakness, that is dealing with a very high level of fear. And as the political pressures rise, and they're very serious, one of China's most successful executives came to my office at Harvard, a guy who's made billions and billions, and companies just on the rise. He said, Bill, the atmosphere in Beijing is you die or I die. This is not what Trump thinks he's dealing with. And as the level of fear gets higher, the bar for what seems like a threat gets lower. So now almost all religious groups are seen as threatening. When 5 women get together to complain about being groped in public, put them in jail, somehow they're a threat. It's a very different system very different situation than what it appears on the surface. Now, I'm going to make 2 balancing points. One is that political complexity is a relentless force. They're going to have to deal with it eventually, and they're not dealing with it now. But the other is that China's Communist Party has built a structure that's mostly quite sound and solid. It's not going to have some kind of great revolution. But let me start with the point that these pressures for some kind of political change, and I'm not using the word democracy. I don't want to make an ideological point. I'm not using the word pluralism. I'm using the word complexity, because in principle, China could come up with something like market allocation of resources on the economic side that would deal with this problem of complexity in a new way. But key groups, entrepreneurs, religious people, lawyers, journalists, provincial leaders, are gradually putting more and more pressure on the system. Let me just talk about business executives. Private company, even if it was started by a state enterprise or the local party secretary, usually has some entrepreneur who's just put his lifeblood into building this company. If the party secretary can call up, so I got a new project downtown. I need you to contribute $1 million by next week. And if I don't get it by next week, you're shut down. And this happens to some of the most successful, most competitive companies in China. I talk to these people. And as the government tries to reduce the overall level of debt leverage in the system, the government and the banks are providing less and less money, and so the local mayor and party secretary have less funding, and who do you think they're going to get it from? They're going to squeeze the private sector, and meanwhile the state enterprises are starting to eat the private companies, and the amount of funding going to private companies is decreasing radically. Almost all the new jobs and almost all the growth in China comes from these legally private companies, and they're in a real squeeze. Now, if you read some of the great classics like Barrington Moore, Landlord and Peasant in the Making of the Modern World, the relationship between a government and the entrepreneurial bourgeois class is very important for the eventual structure of a regime. So I'm not saying that Western-style democracy is likely or inevitable. I don't believe that. But there's a huge price for not having some kind of system, like the idea they have for the economic side, that copes with this crisis of success on the political side. Having said that, I want to make a point. Here I separate from almost every Western social scientist on the solidity with which much of the Chinese system has been built. Let me start with the economists. The leading development economists of our day are Acemoglu and Robinson, Harvard and MIT. And they've shown pretty persuasively that if you want to sustain economic development over a long period of time, you need to have an inclusive society. Everybody needs to feel they have a stake. And they constantly make derogatory comments about China because they assume that if it's not politically inclusive, it must not be economically inclusive. Well, let me tell you how to create an inclusive society in a very poor country. And this is the experience of all these Asian miracle economies. You start with land reform. Take the society's major asset and you distribute it so that most families have a piece of this. In China, they followed a very circuitous route to this, first taking all the land away and then giving it back. But the result was the same as in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. And then you give everybody an education, so everybody has a chance to make it. And these societies have been brilliant at that, all under Leninist-style politics with socialist-style economics. And then you give everybody a job, mostly in the modern sector. How do you do that? You build good infrastructure and you create rules that attract investment in labor-intensive manufacture. So everybody gradually moves out of the rural areas and goes to work in a textile factory or a computer assembly factory. Labor-intensive is the key. This is what doesn't happen in India. In India, a third of the population ends up illiterate, and half of the women end up illiterate, and they can't build the infrastructure. so they don't develop this universal set of jobs. And who gets most of these jobs? Women. In traditional society, got agriculture, and what counts is muscles. And men have slightly bigger muscles, so the men run everything. And China is horribly repressive of women in traditional society. But you visit one of these factories, there'll be 11 Taiwanese guys and 8,000 Chinese women. Now, it's still unfair that it's 11 Chinese guys, Taiwanese guys, but most of the jobs are going to women. Whether it's a computer factory or a textile factory, they want women. And so the women get out of these very oppressive villages where totally under the control of the father or the brother's brother. And the first year, they have a pretty rough time. And then they develop a very independent spirit. There's wonderful literature on this. And they are the ones who understand the modern industrial world. And they are the ones who save up. And if they go back to the village, they're the ones with the down payment on a home. So the role of women is just transformed. There's still lots of gender problems for women in China. But I'll give you one indicator of the degree of change, which unfortunately a lot of our social scientists miss. It used to be that to get married, a woman had to bring a dowry. Now, if you want to date, the guy has to show that he has an apartment. Just totally fundamental shift in the social balance. Well, then you give everybody a home. Guess which society has the highest rate of home ownership on the planet? China, 85%. For the US, it goes up and down between 62 and 64%. And we're a place that really promotes home ownership. And then you have a great property price inflation. Again, this has happened in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China. And so that home suddenly becomes worth a lot, even for the peasant. And so everybody has a sense of a stake in society. And so this has nothing to do with political inclusiveness. In fact, when you introduce democracy at that low level of development, you have landlords and peasants. And I've operated in politics in these countries. The landlords can donate money, they can get organized. The peasants couldn't donate a centavo to a politician. They have no idea how to organize in their interests. They have no idea what's going on. They do what the landlord tells them to do. And so in India, the Philippines, Thailand, you get wonderful educational institutions like the Indian Institutes of IITs, technology. And that's for the elite. But a third of the population remains illiterate. You get these wonderful hospitals. Medical systems for the elite are fantastic. But your likelihood that your kid will die within a year after being born is 5 or 6 times as high in India as in China. And the likelihood that the mother will die is also very high. So inclusiveness has an opposite relationship to political inclusiveness from what a lot of the American ideology, including supposedly hard-headed economists, think. Likewise, China is dealing with its basic problems. The environment. China's digging itself out of a deep hole in the environment, obviously, but it's spending more than any place else in the world. It's spending a lot more than the US, spending a lot more than all of Europe. cleaning things up. It's the leader in every form of green energy, battery-powered cars, you name it. China is the leader. India, they say they're going to clean up the Ganges River, and absolutely nothing happens. So in the book, I go through all these crucial areas for crucial to the stability of the regime, and conclude that China's doing pretty well. So the Communist Party has the role of leadership to lose. It's done so much for the people of China. But the Kuomintang Party in Taiwan was in that position. And then they started behaving like an interest group. When the opposition won an election, the Kuomintang tried to sabotage the economy to make the opposition look bad, and it destroyed its legitimacy. What's happening in China is more subtle. At the beginning of reform, Deng Xiaoping made probably the most difficult decision a communist leader can make. The most powerful lever of control was control of the farms through the communes. He could control the life of every person in great detail. But the peasants in Anhui started taking the farms back, going against everything the party had stood for. And Deng Xiaoping looked at this and said, they seem to be making the country more prosperous, and they seem to like it a lot. Let's not only tolerate this, let's spread it everywhere. Looking back through the eyes of our Western economists, this looks like an obvious thing to do. You look at it from Deng Xiaoping's view, looking forward, this was an unbelievable risk. And then later, Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin faced the same kind of decision in urban industry. They decided to step back. And because the economic consequences were so positive, people actually supported the party more. Huge risk, but it was a bet that worked. That kind of behavior is the kind of behavior of leaders who are scared and who are serving as the vanguard of their society. What we see now, what would be the comparable thing now? Now the comparable thing would be step back from direct control of state enterprises. Step back from control of the legal system. The economic and social consequences would be very beneficial, but instead they're saying, we're going to grab every lever of power we can, no matter how small, and it's much more important than the economic reform program. Everywhere where you have a conflict between political control and economic reform, political control triumphs. That is a party behaving as an interest group, not as a vanguard. And that is the fundamental risk to the system. So how might this all work out? I think we have to go very abstract here. Optimists say, well, Xi Jinping is going to do the economic reform, it's going to be successful, and then somebody else is going to come along and do some kind of political reform. That's less likely now with the third term, but I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't a third term. Another possibility is do successful economic reform and then no political reform. Well, the lesson of history is that economic success makes these interest groups bigger, more powerful, more demanding, and this is a bulldozer that you don't want to get in front of. They're going to have to deal with it. How about if economic reform doesn't happen? Well, then you get what I call the Japan scenario. What happened in Japan after 1975 was 5 interest groups essentially got ownership of the government. Retail, agriculture, banking, property, and construction. They defend themselves against domestic competition, against foreign competition. The economy just stagnates. That's what the reformers who wrote China 2030 and the Third Plenum were afraid of. Now in Japan, they stagnate at $45,000 per capita. So a family of three has $135,000 a year on average. That's pretty comfortable. Doesn't leave the Japanese terribly unhappy. China would plateau probably around $15,000 per capita. And the Chinese people are just not going to accept plateauing at a third of Japanese per capita incomes. So if economic reform is successful, they're going to have to address the political issue. If economic reform is a failure, they're going to have to address the political issue. Unlike 25 years ago, when I had one very strong prediction: China is going to become a superpower because this economic reform is working. I can't tell you what's going to happen. What I can tell you with total confidence is that things will change. And almost every Chinese, including at the top levels in the government, understands that. One of China's great strengths is they continue to define themselves as a developing country. They know that the economics is going to change. And the politics hasn't reached the end of history. The American fallacy a few years ago was that the Western system had reached the end of history. Everything was going to stay the same. American fallacy about China is the view in Washington that China's going to remain the same and continue to power along with fantastic economic growth for the indefinite future. All the most thoughtful people, including ones very close to Xi Jinping, talk about the need for change. My message to Americans is that don't conclude that we're at the end of history and base foreign policies on the assumption that there's going to be this unified, powerful, authoritarian behemoth that just grows at 6 or 7% for the rest of history. It's going to be much more complicated than that. Thank you. Let me stop there. Questions and not just questions, but comments are very welcome. Yes.
I want to know something about state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises, the city power is the character of China, and China wants to be everything under control, right? SOEs is also the same thing, right? Someone criticized SOEs that lack of innovation or misallocation of resources in market. But someone that have high welfare. But it is the main point, the main point of the conference, B20, part of the world critic China and the SOE lack of innovation or something else. So, do you think SOE need, whether SOE need a reform or not? Can you predict SOE future?
So the question is, do the state enterprises need reform? Can they be innovative? Obviously, the government likes the control. The lesson of every country is that big enterprises are not particularly innovative. That's true in this country. Our giant enterprises are not particularly innovative. Big companies didn't invent Google or Apple or anything. Our automobile companies were completely stagnant until they faced serious Japanese competition. And they're particularly not innovative if one is totally dominant. China likes the idea of national champions. One big company will become dominant, have to absorb the weaker companies. That is not how innovation happens. And particularly when you put in a politician, the party committee to inject political considerations, it's going to make them even less innovative. And if you give them a lot of special advantages and subsidies, then they become even less innovative. If you look at who is competitive and successful in China, Lenovo had almost, it started with $25,000, 200,000 RMB. It became very strong and competitive because the guy who started it didn't have any help. He had to fight and become competitive. And if you look at the Chinese car companies that are successful, it's the ones from out in the provinces that didn't get the major state support. And so China's no different from anywhere else. The dynamism comes from the small and private enterprises. And they're getting less capital. The state enterprises are eating them up. And investment rates in the private sector, and I have a long section in the book. China's private sector is not like the Western private sector. Everything is connected to the state in all sorts of ways, but it's still a lot more dynamic than the state enterprise. The investment growth rate used to be 18%. It went all the way down to 2%. It's now back to about 6%. That's less than the overall growth of the economy. So that's not a good sign. The economics of political control doesn't work very well. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, I don't know how U.S. media depict the trade war things between China and the U.S., but from Chinese media, I can clearly feel the tension between U.S. and China. So what do you think the trade war will shape the reformation of the economy in China? What do you think how this trade war will impact our economy, I mean China?
The question is how the trade war will impact economic reform in China. Unfortunately, I think it will be very, very negative. Xi Jinping actually has planned to do some very serious market liberalization, and he faces tremendous domestic pressure. But now, if he does the things that he wants to do anyway, and they're in the reform plan, it looks like backing down under foreign threat. And that just makes it much more difficult. Having said that, I think that China's future economic success is not going to be based mainly on the trade war. China's growth today comes solely from the domestic economy. Net exports have not been growing for years. Exports grow and imports grow, but they grow together, so the economy doesn't get significant growth. Growth comes from domestic investment and consumption. what will impact it is if the rate of foreign direct investment slows down. China is hugely dependent on foreign direct investment. And if foreign direct investors continue to be alienated, and they were alienated before the trade war, then, and if Xi Jinping does the Japanese thing and continues to create Chinese standards that are different from international standards, China, let me be very clear, China's big enough in the world economy, it should have a say, a very strong say in what international standards are. But if it creates standards that isolate the Chinese economy, then that's very negative. In the early days, the electronics industry, cell phones, China made its national standards consistent with Motorola's, which was the international standard. And that led to a tremendous expansion of the domestic market, and it linked China to the global economy. At the time, Japan had the 5 best cell phone companies in the world. And they deliberately created a standard that excluded Motorola from the market. And the result was they got complete control of the domestic Japanese market, but they lost the world market. And that's how Apple and Samsung and Xiaomi got their chance. If the Japanese had continued an open policy, they would totally dominate the world cell phone market today. So the risk is that the Sino-American tension plus some of the trends in the way Xi Jinping is managing security standards and software standards and so on could start pushing China in the direction of being more closed off like Japan. At the moment, it's much, much more open than Japan. And this is something, this is one of many things that the Trump administration doesn't get. China's more open to trade, it's more open to foreign direct investment than Japan and South Korea. And even in the banking industry, my last book was called Renminbi Rising. It was about Chinese efforts to internationalize the Chinese currency, and I had to look up how much of the banking assets is controlled by foreigners. And it's very small, but the number for China is about double the number for Japan. So when we talk about the Chinese, the valid US complaints in the trade war, intellectual property theft, forced transfer of intellectual property, and lack of access to the services sector. The access to the service sector is a heck of a lot more than in Japan. So there's a lot of hypocrisy and just dumb ignorance in Washington's policies today. Somebody else?
So I can't see if there are other questions, but I'll ask a question now. So I have a question about your prediction about change, and particularly whether or not the problem for the Communist Party is that any change which looks like political reform creates a kind of snowball. And so that it's sort of like the Soviet Union example. So that ever since you had how the Soviet Union's collapse played out, it's become incredibly difficult for reformers within the party to do something gradual and controlled. One, because they fear getting labeled as a reformer, like Gorbachev, which is bad, and that happened to Zhu Rongji, which it wasn't even true, but it hurt him politically. And also, too, that it could actually create a kind of a cycle that they couldn't control.
So the question is, if the Communist Party starts doing political reform, will it create a situation like a snowball rolling down hill where it gets out of control? That's always a risk. In Korea and Taiwan, and today gradually in Singapore, the snowball is rolling downhill very slowly, but the people are very happy. And the ruling party in Singapore is still doing very well, even though it has more opposition. And the LDP in Japan has maintained power, even though it's lost the prime ministership for 2 or 3 years out of 60 some. One of the ideas when Hu Jintao was president of Central Party School in China, very innovative, deep thinking institution. Under Hu Jintao, they worked on 3 scenarios for democratization. And one was based on the Japanese system. The idea is you have one party in control, but you have elections and they affect the balance of factions within the party. The Japanese wouldn't like that description, but it's reality. I think that's a system that could work. It depends on how the party manages itself. It is true that steps toward democracy tend to create enthusiasm for more democracy. But if change is gradual and the people are happy and the party still has more resources and a higher reputation than anybody else, that's not a life and death risk. The more, so all scenarios have risks. The risk in keeping the current structure is that it becomes very brittle and you get a sharp break at some point. And that's the worst outcome for the party and for the country. Another scenario they had was start to allow multiple parties, and they even talked about having allowing the Kuomintang to compete, and maybe it would win a governorship in Fujian or something. I think the main point is if the party is vanguard, it wants what will make the people happy, and if it continues to make decisions that are focused on the welfare of the people, like the LDP, it will retain its leadership. If it doesn't, something, hopefully in their view, relatively gradual, would change in the balance of power. So there's no easy option, but I think even people close to Xi Jinping would argue that the party hasn't, that the jargon hasn't figured out the way to link the party to the people. figured out how they want to link the party to the government, figuring out how to link the party to the enterprises. They haven't really got the link to the people right yet. And a lot of very senior communist thinkers phrase it that way. So I think the decisions for change will come from inside. And I'd link that to a comment about American policy. I think that when we have a very confrontational policy toward China, and we're using all these institutions to try to push democracy, that makes liberalization much more difficult in China. China is, or at least as nationalistic as we are. And when some foreigner is telling them how they should govern themselves, they react very strongly. So I think that's one of many ways that American policy right now has it backwards. We solved all the questions about China's future. Oh, sir, yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned, so you predict there will be big changes, and the Communist Party needs to make a lot of difficult choices. Do you think to what degree that the fact that Xi Jinping grew up during the Cultural Revolution, under the Mao's era, so will that kind of experience play some role in the choices he's going to make? The reason I'm asking this is because I'm thinking about like Bo Xilai, right? When he was competing for power, so he thought, kind of what Mao's model, right? And he lost power. But amazingly, after Xi came to power, and he seems also to be replicating some of the things that Mao did. So that sometimes makes me wonder, what we are seeing today, are they just inevitable because some of the influences they may have gained during the time they grew up? Or I'm just thinking also about like the Asian miracle. So these other Asian countries, the choices they made, but their leaders didn't have those kind of experience. So I wonder how you would reflect on those kind of factors.
The question is, did Xi Jinping's youth experiencing the Cultural Revolution lead him to some of the policies he has today? I don't think I have a very good answer to that question. Bo Xilai picked some Maoist policies. He liked Maoist songs. He liked the idea of mobilizing popular enthusiasm. But the essence of the Cultural Revolution was tearing down the institutions of government. And Bo Xilai was extremely effective in building and using the institutions of government. If you go to Dalian or Chongqing, they talk about it. He built great road systems and wonderful bridges, and the traffic actually moves in Chongqing, unlike a lot of other places. And so he picked the relatively superficial political things and kept the reformist infrastructure. Most of the people, and I've had some very good friends who experienced the Cultural Revolution, reacted so strongly against it that they became very market-oriented, they became very institution-oriented, the great reformers. One of my books that I never finished had stories of heroes of reform, short biographies, and they had such terrible experiences that they went to the other extreme. So I don't completely understand Xi Jinping's psychology. I'm sure he picked up some things. He's he's trying to resurrect Marxism as an ideology. Some of these things just aren't going to work in the modern world. And I think of Marx as one of the great social scientists of history. But all his practical predictions went wrong for one reason. He didn't understand the rise of a middle-class society. If there's one core phenomenon that's the essence of China today, it's the emergence of a middle-class society. So he seems to be bringing these things from the past in an attempt to create a kind of stability. It's kind of a mishmash. He's not trying to destroy institutions the way Mao did, but he's destroying a lot of the norms. In a way, he's like Donald Trump. We Americans thought there were certain norms of behavior, and norms like no third term, norms like the way the promotion process works, and the way officials are evaluated. He's effectively gone backward in the interest of control. I guess the one thing I see very clearly is that the thing he worries about is party control and personal control. And everything is subordinate to that. So if he can use nationalism or Marxism or traditional culture or change norms, he will do whatever is important to power. And that's part of what I describe is, to me, the key risk to the system is behaving like an interest group where what counts is my power and my colleagues' power, not the general prosperity. And that goes, it's this personal concern. You look at all his titles. Most Americans, including the social scientists, look at this long list of titles. It's all very, very powerful. I've been an executive in a big company. The CEO, who also wants to make himself the director of every division, is either not a good delegator or he's afraid to delegate. All these to me are signs of deep, deep insecurity. And there may be many other things, including Cultural Revolution experience, but I see that as the core. One last question.
What do you think of the One Belt and One Road initiative and the prospection of the Asian infrastructure investment bank? So do you think it's a good way to promote the growth of the Chinese economy and the international economy?
The question is, what do I think of One Belt, One Road? Is it good for the Chinese economy and the world economy? We'll finish up this session about breakfast tomorrow. Let me try to give a short answer. I think the vision of One Belt, One Road is the most positive national strategy in the world today. It's a very constructive theft of American intellectual property. How did America win the Cold War? It wasn't military. We had a military standoff with the Soviet Union. We created an economic system based to revive Europe, to revive Japan, to start development in the rest of the world with a development bank, the World Bank, which funded infrastructure, and institutions like GATT, WTO, IMF, that would create common standards and promote open world trade. And that gave us and our allies a self-sustaining prosperity and growth. Whereas the Soviet Union put everything into the military and went bankrupt. One Belt, One Road just takes that idea and changes it. It's Bretton Woods with Chinese characteristics. Much bigger development banks, several. Build infrastructure, create common standards for everything from the gauge of railroad tracks to customs standards. There are certain parts of the world that the Bretton Woods system didn't get to. Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa. If One Belt, One Road were to succeed, it would not only be good for the world and good for China, it would be good for the United States. Because whenever you develop one of these countries, you eliminate a problem for the world. Now, in 1966, Indonesia had more violent Islamic jihadis than the whole rest of the world combined. And they ended up shifting away. Indonesia at the time claimed all of Southeast Asia. They gave up their claims to all of Southeast Asia and focused on the economy. And they had the Berkeley Mafia, because so many of their ministers were graduates of the University of California, Berkeley. And the Harvard Institute of International Development provided a lot of the policy support. And the economy became so successful that the radical Muslim movement essentially faded. Now, likewise, Bangladesh should have become a kind of giant jungle Somalia. It was scheduled to be a mess. But the textile industry kind of slopped over from Hong Kong and China under this Chinese-American cooperation. And now it's the world's second largest producer of garments and textiles. So all those women got jobs and the country stabilized. And we have a huge terrorism problem that we don't have to deal with. Ethiopia has been the world's fastest growing country. It was a terrible, terrible place. I worked there for a while. It had 6 wild Marxist-Leninist parties killing each other and a terrible famine and millions of people starving. Now it's stable, partly because of Chinese policies that are very much like One Belt, One Road. The problem is, vision is wonderful, but the implementation has a lot of problems. The US had friendly relations with almost all the countries it was trying to help, not with Latin America, but Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe. China has created sovereignty issues with every country from Korea and Japan around to India. Sovereignty issues are very tough. We tried for half a century to get Cuba to trade sovereignty for economic benefits. They don't buy it. They won. And One Belt, One Road has become a creature of state enterprises going out and doing something that's in their interests. So in Sri Lanka, a state enterprise does a corrupt deal with the previous prime minister to build a port in his hometown. And the port is built where the sea is very shallow. So it's not commercially useful, it's not useful for the Navy. And so everybody goes to the port just around the corner. But it creates huge debt, and then the Chinese company takes ownership of the port. Western companies used to do this in Africa, and we've paid a heck of a price. I mean, I've been personally involved in and big companies manipulating African countries' politics. And eventually there's a pushback. So again, China needs to, grand vision. I wish there was somebody in Washington who could restore our old vision or make a deal with China, a common vision on One Belt, One Road. That would be the best thing for the world. But again, China has some fundamental decisions to make. And it will be a wonderful thing if they make one kind of decision and not so wonderful if it's a different kind of decision. Well, thank you very much for coming. It's been great to talk with you.